in this episode.
Let's introduce Marxism into the equation. Because Marxism actually would insist on a completely different footing than the Schmittian friend-enemy distinction. Because in a certain way, this distinction cannot be ontologized. For if we ontologize this distinction, we miss out on Marx's core idea in the Communist Manifesto, that as the class struggle of the working class matures and becomes more successful, it's not that the bourgeoisie remain an ontological enemy, for if that were the case, the whole conception of bourgeoisie would be eligible for annihilation. It's a question of violence. No, that's not what Marx and Engels say. What they say is that there will be defectors from bourgeoisie. Because class is not an identity. Class is not some static thing. It's not just like, you're thrown into this class Weltanschauung for which you cannot escape, right?
Yeah.
That's not how the Marxist views class. They view class as a relation. And the society is in a shifting mode of production. So if the mode of production shifts, the class relation shifts.
György writes, the comrade figures a political relation that shifts us away from preoccupations with survivors and systems, away from the suppositions of unique particularity and the impossibility of politics, and toward the sameness of those fighting on the same side. Jacques Derrida, in his characteristic fashion of playing with dichotomies, paraphrases Aristotle's strange sentiment, "Oh, my friends, there is no friend." In this episode, Marxist and psychoanalytic philosopher Daniel Tutt explores the notion of comradeship in the tradition of Marxism and friendship's relation to politics and emancipation. I've been a student of Daniel from afar for a long time through his writings and public talks. He's a writer, teacher, host of the Emancipations podcast, and is the author of Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, The Crisis of Initiation, and How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. If you, like me, are politically disoriented and somewhat in a state of despair, I highly recommend checking out Daniel's work. Particularly if you enjoyed the previous episodes of his fellow travelers, Andrew Flores, Richard Boothby, or Todd McGavin, then Daniel Tutt will be right up your alley, hopefully giving you a better framework to analyze our current moment. And now let's go to the episode after a quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times that I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you another product or service that you probably don't need. That being said though, and forgive me for the tautology, we, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing research for my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall goodies. As far as I'm concerned, you're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's always gonna be free is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters, and if you're considering supporting my work, please do so only if you have the means, especially in our precarious times. Alright, now to the episode.
All right, my friend, let's do this.
Perfect, let's do it 100%. But yeah, Daniel, as I was saying, I've been a student of yours from far, so it's wonderful to break the parasocial barrier. And yeah, given it's your first time on the podcast, I normally like to ask a sort of introductory question to the guest, even for myself, because I've never really asked you this before, given this is the first time we are talking to each other. Yeah, you've written 2 books. You've written the one, How to Read Like a Parasite, sort of a critical reading of Nietzsche and left Nietzscheanism, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche, and the other one, which I don't know a copy, but with Palgrave, Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, a very pertinent topic for sure. And so, perhaps as a bit of an introductory question to our audience, I'm curious, why in particular did you choose to write these 2 books?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm a huge fan as well. So these books are certainly singular The Nietzsche book I can speak about briefly first. It became important to me as a philosopher who was first introduced to philosophy from Friedrich Nietzsche, as you know from reading the text. It became important to me to make a kind of account or an appraisal of the political Nietzsche. So the book is an examination of a big debate, largely in the 20th century, late 20th century, about what precisely are Nietzsche's politics and how do we read those politics. So the book takes Nietzsche very seriously as an antagonist, probably one of the most important antagonists to the left, and tries to show that some left-wing Nietzschean orientations, although I introduce a whole spectrum to them, it's a very interesting spectrum of left Nietzscheanism, which I used to be a part of. So a lot of my work is about this idea of the notion of what it means to be on the left and the way that we conceptualize theory and its intersection with practice, with socialist organizing, with the kind of politics that is trying to define Marxism for our time. So with my first book on the family, I was really trying to build in the tradition of Engels, Friedrich Engels, in his work on the origins of the family, and raise another question, right, about the meaning of family abolition. And the question that I was interested in as somebody who's started a family myself was, how does one relate to the family as a Marxist? Given that we have this legacy, this history, can we think the family in a liberated way? What does it mean to think emancipation and the family? And there's a kind of historical dynamic here whereby post-2008, a lot of people in younger generations are facing profound constraints with reproducing the family. So the book is looking at social reproductive theory. Obviously, it's looking at psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is compelling to me because I do think that the general idea that Marxism requires a look at the question of subjectivity. And so psychoanalysis to me has always been important in that way. So this was an opportunity to sort of combine those interests in those two books. And then I have a forthcoming work that I think you may be aware of.
Lukács, yeah.
Well, I have multiple actually forthcoming works. One on Lukács, which will be sort of an introduction to Lukács, the great Hungarian Marxist philosopher, where I'm trying to sort of look at his later work and sort of reappraise Lukács's legacy, because there's been a lot of debates, a lot of contentious questions about who actually is the real Lukács, and what does he say to our present. So this is the effort of that book, but then I also have another book that I'm actually going to work on for a wonderful press called Revol Press, and this will basically be about a kind of ethnographic and philosophical study of the contemporary working class. So it's kind of like a heavy deep dive into the condition of the global proletariat in today's time. So those are some book projects. But I also have a Substack, and I also write essays. But frankly, Rahul, I love the whole process. I became sort of enamored with the process of writing a book, in the discipline that it takes, the kind of daily ritual involved with writing is something that I find extremely attractive. Waking up very early in the morning to work on it. And I would say the idea of talking about something that you've written in a form of a book with somebody who's read it and sort of taken it seriously, I think there's no better intellectual experience than that, in my opinion.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's so much I'd like to say in response. I mean, for me, Sort of like before we started recording, I was mentioning that I'd love to, partake in some of your book studies and all that, and likewise, I'd love to just do like deep dive into texts and break them apart, do my own writing, do my own exploration. But of course, the big problem in capitalist society is its time and energy, and I find that that's for me the ultimately what I'm constantly fighting for, to sort of carve out a space that I call as my own, so to speak, loosely speaking. And like, for instance, this podcast, I'm doing this before work, just because I know that this enriches my life in that regard. And I completely agree. There's something sublime in just that process of writing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say for folks that are, the other thing is that as you get older, right, writing changes. Your relationship to writing changes. And this is very significant. It's something I wasn't expecting. I think that, something happens. And you end up overcoming certain internal self-censors. And you begin to relate to your own writing as a project of truth-telling. This I'm speaking anecdotally for myself, but also as a project of discovery, of something inside of you is speaking through you. And this is I don't know. I mean, I really think that this is the heart of writing, which is this idea that there's a kind of inspiration. There's an inspiration in writing that is undeniable. You have to stick with it, though. It doesn't just happen. It usually is only produced through this like extraordinarily difficult process of failure after failure after failure. So, just stick with it, and surround yourself with people that will be willing to give you feedback, right? And over time, I think you find a voice. You find a voice. And that isn't, once you find a voice, you then start to dream in your voice and you start to see a direction develop. So, that's the power of writing for me.
Is writing, it sounds to me like it's both. Is it explicative or is it exploratory? So you're writing to analyze and figure something out for yourself, or is it where, hey, I figured all these things out, let me try and articulate it, let me try and explicate?
I mean, for me, writing has to communicate. At a certain point, Rahul, in the tradition of philosophy that I studied, which is sort of post-Marxism, continental philosophy, post-Kantian philosophy, reading some of the canonical figures, but also reading a lot of the more modern and even postmodern figures. I really was having a difficult time breaking from these kind of regimes of very technical jargon, and the system of publishing, academic publishing, doesn't help because a lot of the journals really don't privilege writing that is concise and that has chosen a way to communicate the jargon in non-jargon form. So you still have a fidelity to the concepts. But what you're doing, I think for me, and this is where the voice comes into play, is that you're trying to enlarge your audience. So it's also a kind of a way of giving generosity to your reader, and this is essential for me. So, that's the measure of my success. The measure of my success is if I can open up a space of greater comprehension of the theory, of the ideas, and communicate them in a way that really connects with people. And with my book on Nietzsche, as you know, I was not shy to incorporate the autobiographical into that.
Started off with talking about your Nietzsche's influence on you.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel as if, philosophy cannot quite escape the biographical. So to some extent,
as Nietzsche himself says.
Yeah, it should be embraced to some extent, right? So that's a big thing for me, right? Which is writing really has a sort of ethical duty to be coherent and to be to something like a general readership. A general readership should be able to comprehend your work. I think this is essential, especially for socialist writing, for socialist theory, for Marxist theory. I would say it's even more essential.
No doubt, no doubt. So when you were, a few minutes ago, you were kind of talking about just on your writing process and why in particular you decided to write the books that I mentioned. You said something which probably is going to be a big theme in our conversation. You said one thing you try to explore is the notion of what it means to be on the left. Now, this for me is not just some abstract theoretical question. For me, it's an existential question. If I may, go on a bit of an anecdote here. I remember the conversation you had with Karel last. He made a very interesting one. He was like, as a leftist, for him, he's currently, or at least ever since 2016, he's in a place of mourning. And for me, that just really, that's exactly where I'm at too right now. I consider myself a leftist. I believe in the little I know about Marxism. I believe in the Marxist project. I think it's a way of being in the world. But I have become extremely despondent about our current moment. Not cynical though, and I think a big part of that is because I'm generally a pretty Pollyanna, kind of happy kind of guy. So it's kind of hard for me to like get into like bad moods and all that. But that's a different story. And so, yeah, I mean, I was thinking, yeah, I mean, we refer to each other as comrades, and that's kind of when I was like, I want to know what it means to be a comrade, and especially in our neoliberal society, and that and I was like, oh, the person to speak to here for sure is Daniel Tutt. And before we even discuss comradeship and György Dean's texts and Derrida and everything we were planning to discuss, I should say, well, a twofold question, let's say, or bipartite question. Firstly, how would you articulate to an audience typically not familiar with Marxist theory or kind of Marxism, what for you personally means to be, what it means to be a Marxist? And then perhaps as a follow-up to that, what is a leftist in modern day politics?
Okay, well, I think there's a lot of ways to get at the meaning of a Marxist, which we can address first. And I'm not going to pull a kind of dogmatic answer, because I do think that Marxism remains, as Jean-Paul Sartre once said, there's still the kind of fundamental groundwork of a critique of modern life, of modern society, which is a critique of capitalist society. So there's something extraordinarily comprehensive about Marx's, not Marxism, but Marx's project. And there's also the sense in which if we wish to separate Marx from Marxism, we're also doing a type of abuse. So this is a big thing I would want to insist in answering your question, which is that Marx should not be so easily separated from Marxism. And in fact, we have a responsibility to this tradition. That would be, I think, something that may be even a point of contention amongst many Marxists or many readers of Marx, because many readers of Marx would claim that there's this philosopher, political economist, Karl Marx, who wrote these very important critical analyses and critiques. Importantly, the word critique is very important of capitalist society, and this scientific production of this philosopher is sort of this objective thing over here. But at the same time, we have the fact that Marx inserts himself in a very, very particular political conjuncture in his time, where Marxism emerges, right? Very early on, actually, after 1848, with the penning of the Communist Manifesto. And one way to think about what Marxism is that it remains a tendency of the wider socialist movement, of the wider workers' movement, that is dealing with the internal contradictions of bourgeois society as it's facing crisis after crisis after crisis. So not only is Marxism, therefore, combining this scientific analysis of capitalist society, but it's also a political practice. It's a political practice that is strategic and always has been. And Marx and Engels also have to be thought together, because Engels had a lot of orientations and projects and texts and books that he wrote, all of which, including his very philosophical text, The Anti-Düring, all of which were fundamentally endorsed by Karl Marx, and the two of them never saw their work as separate, in fact. True intellectual comrades, in a way which truly defines the idea of comrade, which we'll get to in a moment. So in that regard, Marxism has to be taken as this tradition, and there has to be, I think, some sense of the continuity of Marxism as a tradition. And like any tradition, it has its blemishes. It has its bright spots, and it has moments in which we see Marxists abuse the tradition. So there is this kind of hermeneutical way of relating to the tradition of Marxism, which I think is extremely important and often forgotten, which is that Marxists sort of stood for what you might call the vanguard of the socialist movement and advocated a certain direction of anti-capitalist politics that has remained and stood the test of time, right? So whereas Lassallism, for example, which was actually in Marx's time, the practice of Ferdinand Lassalle, it had a very particular idea of a critique of social democracy, but it did not last, right? It sort of spurned out. Same with like Blanquism, right? So there's certain tendencies which didn't stand the test of time. Marxism has stood the test of time, and that I think is a testament to the unity of this objective scientific part of Marx and his critique of political economy, combined with the political practice. I myself think that we have to unite these two poles of the Marxist project in order to remain true to Marxism. Okay. So that's what I would say. Now, specifically, Marxism is, very well defined in some very particular texts. Marx himself in his later years was very hesitant to even see his project as developing this idea of followers. Like, if there are kind of like this point that Christ would make, don't conceive of my teachings as like following me dogmatically. There's constant references in Marx to a non-dogmatic position. There's constant references to Marx towards a non-bureaucratic position, apropos the state. Marx is very critical of the state. In fact, Kojin Karatani, the great Japanese Marxist philosopher, thinks that after the Paris Commune, Marx actually sublates and therefore incorporates Bakunin's theories of the state, and effectively overcomes the difference between anarchism and communism after the Commune. And so this idea of that the state must wither goes against the idea also of what happened after 1917 under Stalin, after Lenin dies, which is we see a rise of a profound bureaucracy, you see. So Marxism contains certain kernels that have to be revisited. If we take the critique of the Gotha program, for example, where Marx offers his concrete advice for how Marxism is to relate to social democracy, to the parliamentary system, we get some indications. We get some indications of what that would look like. One of the things that we know, I think, that is very, very true, is that Marxism is opposed to a kind of reformism, a reformism that would be around a reaffirmation, say, of, welfare, what we now know as like sort of welfare, progressive welfare policies. Now, this is interesting, and this may be very obvious to people, but if you look at contemporary right-wing or even centrist neoliberal parties, they usually stereotype progressive neoliberals as Marxists, which is very false, right? Because one of the things that defines Marxism, for sure, is the notion and the affirmation that capitalism cannot be reformed. Right? Capitalism cannot be reformed. Now, the Marxists will, at the same time, for strategic reasons, because that means that what defines Marxism is its commitment to revolution. But just as in Russia, for example, and in Germany, Marxists coexist with social democracy, with the kind of mainstream, and that will also include reformist socialists. So that's actually a huge debate regarding the history of Marxism. And I think it's important to clarify that, which is that Marxism is not unequivocally opposed to cooperation with social democrats. No, we have a history there, right? And I think that should be honored. But in the last instance, Marxism is going to be a revolutionary practice for the abolition of capitalist society. So that's how I would define it. I think that there's a lot of philosophical points underneath what I just said that I could articulate and could elaborate, but I don't want to
No doubt.
kind of go on and on. So please jump back in with any.
I would say go
questions.
on, listen to Emancipations with Daniel Tutt for the philosophical analysis. because
there's a question about there's a question in Marx that's ambiguous regarding teleology. You know, was Marx primarily a Hegelian?
This is where Zizek comes in, yeah.
Right, whereby, you know, because most Hegelians kind of took on the mantle of something like left-wing progressivism, if you will, right, whereby the liberal state, kind of progresses through stages of continual advancement and continual improvement. That's not Marx's sort of prophecy, if that's the right word, for the dissolution of capitalism. Marx actually, in the later work of Capital, sees the capitalist system as inevitably facing contradictions which will collapse it as a system. And as such, out of that destruction comes communism, right? And there is therefore a huge debate regarding the means and the methods by which the transition from capitalism to communism takes place. I will say this, Rahul. If you study Engels, because Marx dies and Engels lives on for, I think, 15 years longer, Engels' later work is full of a lot more interesting debates and polemics regarding those questions of reform and revolution, of transition, and how Marxism relates to, because you see, Engels gave the blessing to the SPD in Germany, the Social Democrats and their party, to basically call themselves Marxists, right? And that's hugely significant. So, authority,
and they were
authority,
reformists. They were more reformists, weren't they? The SPD, would you say?
In general, yes. Not all of them. But in general, that was the tendency, which is generally the tendency of any parliamentary socialist enterprise, right? It has to work within the boundaries of the democratic system, you know. And this is a big debate regarding Marx's relationship to democracy, which we can talk about, and the question of the transition vis-a-vis the very important concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So there's a lot to discover, or, you know, and to learn about. But I think what's most important is this: always be suspicious of people that want to separate Marx from Marxism. That's my main point.
I promise this will be the only interruption. In the past few years, I truly have cherished connecting with all you listeners of this podcast, whether through email, video calls, or simply the comments. And I'd hate to lose this fledgling community we've built around our shared love for philosophy and science, and so I'm kindly asking you to consider subscribing to this podcast on Substack. Let's cut the BS. In our techno-feudalist times, no platform is perfect, and at the end of the day, these companies own us. However, if I may naively be hopeful, Substack at least allows me to export email addresses for me to keep connected with you all if one of these platforms decides to kick me off for some reason, which, as we're well aware, they've done in the past with no explanation. In fact, this almost happened to me recently. So please, let's stay connected through Substack, and if all else fails, at least the good old SMT protocol. That is a nerdy joke for you programmers out there.
I don't think it's so easy to do that.
Yeah, there's a lot for me to think about there. And I don't know that point you made about separate Marx from Marxism. I mean, in a way, I wonder if I've done that, because I try to study Marxists and Marxian philosophy as more as a philosopher, and I kind of at times forget the praxis. But I think you, early on in the conversation, really made clear that these two things, especially in that tradition, come together. They're coupled. And there's a lot there. So I do want to discuss, and this is a really important part for me too, especially in the text Comrade by György Lukács. She speaks of discipline, and I really want to touch on that point too as Marxist. I'm more interested in kind of like existentially how we should engage with our current moment. We'll get to that for sure. But one, I guess, slightly related point, but even a bit of a detour here, is this event that took place in the US, was it last month, in September, I think, when Charlie Kirk got assassinated. And I just want to say before we, as I mentioned before we started recording, I would hate to just make this like, oh, let's just do a political commentary on whatever that took place in American politics. But I felt it was one of those events that kind of shook the world, and we're so discovering, or we're figuring out what the after effects or the aftermath is. And the broader question I have more is pertaining to political violence, Daniel, and how, I mean, okay, the philosophy of violence can be a book of its own for sure, but just as comrades, as Marxists, how should we relate to this notion of violence? And in your view, how do we engage with when an event like this takes place, which for sure will happen again? It's just part of the world we live in. How, as comrades, as Marxists, how should we engage with such events of real, extreme and very, very brutal political violence? And again, I completely, with all the caveats that compared to what we're seeing, genocides, all of that, Gaza, just this particular event. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this and what kind of reflections you've done on what took place.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think from a Marxist point of view, I would say that terrorism there's a long history of kind of categorical rejection of terrorism. And I think that this event qualifies as terrorism, and therefore I think that it must be renounced and never celebrated. I think that to celebrate an event like this represents what I would call, Rahul, kind of an anti-politics, and I would sort of qualify this notion of anti-politics as the all too easy or immediate relationship to what qualifies as political, as a kind of based on a logic of immediacy, right? So in a way, this is exactly what the status quo wanted the event to elicit. The status quo wanted for this event to stoke up the worst parts of our nature. It wanted us to act in a way which would be very polarized. Either we are for it or we are against it. I think without question, we must be against it. Even if the killer, so-called Tyler Robinson, is motivated by the ideological constellation that we're told he's motivated by, which is kind of subcultural leftism, I think as Marxists, we obviously need to reject this. In other words, that's not the basis by which ideologically we make excuses or feel bad for him or have solidarity with him or anything like that. But let me be very clear that I don't think that we have enough information objectively that's provable, that's that is concrete regarding the fact as to whether this was actually an ideologically motivated crime, precisely because there's so much conflicting data coming out about it and information. We need to wait for the case to appear in court and to see how that plays out. I think one of the things that's clear, though, is that there are certainly actors interested in kind of fomenting this event as a sort of a means to push and prod into existing political divisions, to exploit them, to exaggerate them, to make them more hyperbolic. And I would say that what that represents from a kind of Marxist point of view is something we don't want to participate in. That would be the submission to this kind of bourgeois anti-politics. Because I think one of the things that's very clear is that the two bourgeois parties in the United States, but these are replicated elsewhere across the West, and to some extent globally, are in a fundamental crisis, almost like a decadence, a crisis of their values, a crisis of their legitimacy. So in that context, the more chaos that is kicked up, the more they actually paradoxically benefit from that chaos. So on that basis, we are legitimizing the status quo when we unthinkingly accept these frameworks that presume that the killer was motivated by this ideology, etc. I think on the other hand, if you were to say who was Charlie Kirk and to what extent was he a far right-wing figure or not, I think this is very interesting. I think to some extent he's a reflection of the norms of the Trump coalition at this moment. You know, he was hugely catalytic to bringing out the young, youth vote for Trump, probably the most important figure in that regard. And I think as such, what I find most interesting about him is that if you look at his discourse, what subtends it is actually a kind of quasi-materialist argument. The fact that Kirk never went to college, but made a reputation of being known for debating college students, and that he always spoke continuously of how his generation is indebted and that they're facing these economic setbacks. Of course, his prescriptions for all of that, I think, are wrong. But the fact that he actually had that means that the left could have seized the basis, the foundation of a lot of his ideas and rerouted them. And so that was actually one of the things I wanted to say, which is I felt that he's a figure who's worth engaging. He's a figure who's worth engaging, even though a lot of his stuff was meant to create kind of clickbait, these kind of ludicrous debates with people that would be kind of pitched at some kind of
like jubilee spectacle,
very culture war based, etc. But there are people on the left who have debated Kirk. I would even say Brianna Joy Green, I think it is, the former staffer Bernie Sanders, Ben Burgess, a few others, who have kind of debated him and brought out his weaker points and his contradictions, and pointed to the fact that your solutions economically are inadequate. Okay, so it's a shame that he's killed. It was a shame that this happened, and I think that I want to give you a chance to follow up, but I have some thoughts about what this signifies moving forward, but they're very notional at this point.
No, I mean, I really couldn't have put it any better myself. I mean, the reason I was in a way a bit even hesitant to bring it up, because obviously it's a very sensitive issue, and it's murder, it's a person's life, but at the same time it's also a symbolic act. And I mean he was an American figure, as you say, somewhat of even like an internet troll, but like even he in Australians are way more apolitical compared to the Americans. Like, people here rarely talk about politics, which just for me is somewhat of a good thing, but also there are issues with that too. But there were just people you wouldn't expect at all to talk about politics, attending like a memorial, like a vigil kind of thing that they had in Melbourne. and there was like the Turning Point Australia had like this memorial for Charlie Kirk, and it was this moment everyone was talking about it, and I was like, wow, this event has gotten a lot of people interested in politics again. And for me, and perhaps one could say this is a bit of like a tactic or a strategy I used, but it was unconscious. With friends of mine, with mates of mine who aren't Marxists, who aren't even leftists for that matter. A lot of them are, you could just say, like, I don't know, center right maybe. And I started discussing kind of the philosophy of violence. I recommended Zizek's book on violence, about subjective violence and objective violence, and look what it means to live in a society we live in. And in fact, that point you made about how we react to such an event is it's sort of the bourgeois parties or the status quo. They can really exploit our reaction to make sure that things remain the way they are, because they are in this sort of decadence at the moment. And I don't know. I think you're right. I think it is very notional, and we shall see what unfolds forward. To put it in a very cliche way.
I would say regarding so a couple points. I think the violence.
Yes, they're all there. Sorry.
No. The violence point is quite interesting, because I would suggest that, in a way, what the genocide in Gaza has permitted is a desensitization to extreme acts of violence, and it's sort of therefore set the stage for this event having some, not to mention the, these acts of mass shooter events, which are really, I think, best understood as these sort of acting out events of psychopathological violence, which reflects the same kind of social decay, social breakdown, the total loss of social trust and any kind of optimism for the future for young people. So in this spirit, this event, which again, we don't even know if it is directly political vis-a-vis the shooter's motivations with whatever subculture leftist ideology he may be motivated by. That's all up for dispute. So there's also this question about the role of state agencies in fomenting this, which we don't even want to speculate. We can speculate if you wish, but it's just totally up in the air. And I think, again, it goes back to the opportunism of violence, right? This idea of violence, and even the distinction between subjective and structural violence that you indicated a moment ago, is almost now blurring when we have these moments of the mass shooter phenomenon or these suicidal acts. Why? Because structural violence is that kind of violence which is built into the system and normalized as such. It's kind of metabolized. It's expected, right? So, for example, the opioid overdose crisis is largely a class issue. It's largely driven by unemployment. It's largely driven by despair. It's largely driven by the evacuation of opportunity in certain regions, right? But because it is so vast of a social phenomenon, we can't see its causality through the lens of capitalism, exactly, even though that is how it's caused. So that would be like structural violence. Now, with these mass shooter phenomenons, they are one-off events that have this spectacle quality. They get news, and they become almost like, in some cases, strange, like anti-heroes. Like, this is what I mean by terrorism. Like a left that celebrates Tyler Robinson, even though most people are not doing that. It was very marginal. Or a left that celebrates even Luigi Mangione, the guy that killed the healthcare CEO. I think this is not an advisable direction. This is almost like Joker politics, the Joaquin Phoenix Joker, where it's like this horizon of nihilism, right? Whereby no sort of like positive social vision is permitted to be concocted because the bourgeois parties have prevented socialism. the consequence of that will be the rise of these types of acts of nihilistic despair. So there has to be a tacit recognition that the politics of despair, it must be rejected. It must be seen
completely
as, a reality, but it can never be affirmed. It can never be affirmed as a horizon, because to affirm it is a full capitulation to the status quo. And I would even say that the status quo would prefer that revolutionaries and socialists just accept that. Accept this weird, perverse, violent act as what defines you. Which is why after the Luigi Mangione assassination of the healthcare CEO, CNN started to bring on young people that were in favor of Mangione to interview them, precisely to delegitimize the left. Because the centrist party has an interest in delegitimizing the left. They want the left to be a subculture. They want the left to be marginal. They want the left to be at the whims of private elite universities. And unfortunately, the reason that you are despairing about the left is because they have been successful in marginalizing the left in that precise way. So the left now is seen as a private project, not a public project. And I don't mean that in the Kantian public-private use of reason, because, of course, in Kant, it's the reverse.
It reverses.
It's the reverse.
In the Enlightenment.
But in simple terms, the left is seen as an elite, sort of vanguardist, antiquated, out of touch, private college expression, which has no palpable connection to the broader masses, to the working class and their condition. So I know that you want to talk about that, but this. So you see my point, which is that the center wants the left to remain that way. I think that Marxism, and this kind of connects to my original point about what Marxism is, has always seen itself also as a corrective of what the left is. Therefore, to be on the left, Marxists should be the ones defining that. Marxists should be the ones defining that. Because the left it's still up for grabs. It's not fixed.
Interesting. What do you mean by that? It's still up for grabs. I wasn't expecting you to say that.
I think this basic idea, even though I'm highly critical of post-structuralism, but this basic idea that the left is a kind of floating signifier has some truth to it. It's a floating signifier with historical grounding in strong principles, which means that at any given time, we fight for the dignity and the preservation of the principles of the left, knowing full well that there are nefarious actors trying to pervert the true meaning of the left. So what I mean by that is that we're always trying to define for the masses, for the working class, the true left. Right?
Yes.
It's not only a priori. It's not only a priori.
Yes, I mean, I just want to, on a bit of a comment on something you said, like this notion of where leftism has become a private project, not in the Kantian sense. I think Jodie Dean, she touches on in her essay Comrade, this notion that some people view leftism as like a self-help project. It's a narcissistic, this thing you do with yourself, like I'm an ally of this, I'm an ally of that, and this group, that group, and you kind of fall into all of that, and that shouldn't, whatever leftism is, and as you kind of interestingly point out, it's kind of like a floating signifier. At least in my view, it can't be like an identity. It can't be something you do to feel good about yourself, even though I certainly do believe engaging in leftist politics does give you a sense of self and a sense of dignity, for sure. And in fact, I think this, for me, is, Daniel, a beautiful segue, sort of more of the topic that I invited you on to discuss, which, yeah, there's just so much we can say about the notion of comradeship. But I think I want to start with something you said in one of your emails regarding friendship, and sort of this notion of how the concept of friendship relates to politics, and I would even argue in that relation there's even a rejection of the politics of despair, which, as you rightly point out, we ought to reject almost as like an ethical duty. And so two texts that you recommended for me to read is Derrida's Politics of Friendship and Joel Didion's Comrade. I don't know which one you want to discuss first, but perhaps, at least for me, more importantly, you said you've got your own kind of ideas of how friendship relates to politics. So I'd probably just say, could you kind of flesh out some of those concepts you've been looking through? That'd be really interesting.
So I suppose the origin point really should be Aristotle, for whom friendship is an extremely central question in his ethics. And what we can say is that friendship has this sort of civic philia dimension. So it's, on the one hand, bound up with love, but we know that this love is not erotic. Something like a kind of fraternal love, right? And therefore, there is this introduction of something like a generic friend, the generic friend. And the affirmation is also that, he says this can take on three forms. It can be a utility-based form. It can be a pleasurable form of friendship, which we know, I think, when you're young, say like a high school student, most of your friends are very much kind of pleasure-based. And I don't mean like sexual pleasure. I mean just like, let's play, right? Let's play soccer.
Hanging out. Just hanging out.
Let's hang out. Let's play video games, right? And then we have friends who have a utilitarian utility purpose, which they are our neighbors. They're tied into sort of mutual protection, etc. We have also friends who I think, and these are the most important for Aristotle, are friends of virtue, right? Which means that they are something like a universal friend, but they participate in furthering something that is capable of strengthening the community, strengthening ties, strengthening bonds. This may be a friend that lifts you in some particular way, whether that be vis-a-vis a sense of standing up for your dignity, standing up for your name, standing up for you in a courageous way, etc., etc. Now, Derrida has reflected quite a lot on the politics of friendship, as you mentioned, in very important ways. And one of the maxims that he brings out is from Montaigne, who lost his dear friend, La Boétie. And these two philosophers, these two intellectuals, were so close as friends that Montaigne says that Aristotle's right in his affirmation that ultimately any one individual can only ever have one true friend. Can only ever have one true friend. And this is very compelling because the motto of Montaigne that he paraphrases from Aristotle is that, "Oh, my friends, there is no friend," is very, very, very interesting because it is a collapse of the universal into the singular, which means that the alterity of having only one true friend is also a collapse of alterity. It's no longer exactly clear whether the relationship that Montaigne has to his best friend is a relationship of a two. No, it's actually fusional. It's actually one in some sense. They have become one. They've become one in thought, in deed, in action, etc. Right? And I think that you would know this when you have had a friend for whom they can finish your sentence. Right? You see, one of the things that is very tragic about our own time is, I would argue, that one of the crises of contemporary capitalism, the social fragmentation of contemporary capitalism, has resulted in the sense that people no longer have friends that rise to this singular status. And that truly is a tragedy, because I think what Montaigne is getting at is that it's not about the quantity, it's about this exceptional exceptional one, right? And the fact that you can only have one friend also means that if you had another friend for whom you shared this level of intimacy, in some sense, the whole basis of the singularity would itself collapse. So it's actually important that it only be two, that it not be multiple. And in fact, once you've introduced a third or a fourth, you almost feel as if something is off. Okay, so this is very significant. But notice that it's very different than these more general civic categories of fraternity and friendship of the common or of the polis or of the group, right? Now, for Derrida, he makes a very compelling argument, but also a very controversial one in his The Politics of Friendship, where he really thinks that Carl Schmitt, the German Nazi jurist, had a point in his wider idea of liberalism, which is, famously built off this notion of the friend-enemy distinction.
Friend-enemy distinction, yeah.
And so this is an important concept, which means that for Schmitt, in order for political relations to have efficacy, to even function, the group, the polis, the nation, etc., the people, etc., must have the capacity for this distinction, for this frontier to be enacted in society. It's very interesting that this idea of the sage who puts forward the maxim, as Aristotle does, "Oh, my friend, there is no friend," comes at the end of his life, because Derrida also points out that Nietzsche emerges in Zarathustra to say, "Oh, my enemies, there are no enemies," meaning that this is the wisdom of the fool, Zarathustra the fool. But within that, Nietzsche is trying to redefine the very status of enmity and of the friend-enemy relation itself. And Derrida spends quite a lot of time showing how Nietzsche basically has a latent politics, and here this is where I kind of disagree with Derrida, has a kind of latent politics which is seeking to push something almost different than Schmitt, right? Which is almost this kind of new awareness that the polis or the group is no longer reducible to the friend-enemy distinction itself, and that there is therefore a kind of fiction of the friend-enemy distinction. And that ushers in Nietzsche's prophecy, I think, this is my interpretation, of the last man. So in a sense, if you take Francis Fukuyama in The End of History, you could define the end of history, the neoliberal era, as one in which we no longer have the means or the capacity to identify enemies and friends. It's something like a post-political horizon. So while I think there's a lot of truth to that, let's introduce Marxism into the equation. Because Marxism actually would insist on a completely different footing than the Schmittian friend-enemy distinction. Because in a certain way, this distinction cannot be ontologized. For if we ontologize this distinction, we miss out on Marx's core idea in the Communist Manifesto, that as the class struggle of the working class matures and becomes more successful, it's not that the bourgeoisie remain an ontological enemy, for if that were the case, the whole conception of bourgeoisie would be eligible for annihilation. It's a question of violence. No, that's not what Marx and Engels say. What they say is that there will be defectors from bourgeoisie, because class is not an identity. Class is not some static thing. It's not just like, you're thrown into this class Weltanschauung for which you cannot escape, right?
Yeah.
That's not how the Marxist views class. They view class as a relation. And the society is in a shifting mode of production. So if the mode of production shifts, the class relation shifts. So that's something that I want to pinpoint, because in Derrida's lectures, he invokes Lukács. And he says that Lukács thinks class like a Schmittian. And then he says that Hegel thinks like a Schmittian. But Derrida neglects to mention that Schmitt hated Hegel. He sought to push Hegel to the margins. So you see my point. This idea that the friend-enemy distinction must be the kind of compass for the legibility of politics, I think is a foolish idea. I think it's a foolish idea. And so I think that Derrida's ultimate prescriptions are interesting. We can talk about those briefly. What I would contend, Rahul, is that what Derrida is basically saying here is a kind of Levinasian idea of, and a kind of anarchist democratic idea of how future democracy, the democracy to come, will create the conditions for what he wants, which is the conception of heteronymous zones of freedom. So this idea of friendship and heteronomy that mutually reinforces autonomy. So he plays a lot with heteronomy and autonomy. And he's trying to think them almost dialectically. He's trying to think this idea of the limits of the enemy, but I think he's also trying to affirm that in a way we should be post-Schmittian. But I think that he's really missing the subtlety of Marx. And so just to be clear, if you ask me, does Marxism maintain that there are class enemies? The answer is yes. But if you ask me, what's the sort of social ontology of that class enemy, right? Here I would say that this is something that is realized through struggle, and that it, to a certain extent, is not fixed. It's not fixed in the same way that identity politics has, I would claim, a kind of implicit, or almost like a lazy Schmittianism, or kind of like a superficial Schmittianism. If we define Schmittianism as this idea that we
ontologizing.
That we must always define ourselves off of an enemy. You see, in a way, it kind of goes back to the Charlie Kirk thing. Is Charlie Kirk an enemy? Well, in a certain sense, yes. But discursively, if Charlie Kirk were engaged with a left that was extremely robust, we could have made Charlie Kirk's entire political career, we could have made him into a real estate agent. If the left was strong. You see my point? Yeah. It's not as if Charlie Kirk is
He's got the hat there for it. Yeah.
Do you see my point?
Yeah.
The point is that to some extent, political actors have to also be thought vis-a-vis discourse. I'm not opposed to discourse, right? I'm opposed to the postmodern affirmation that everything is reducible to discourse, right? No, there are actually material determinations of our social life. It's not just like pure floating signifiers and meaning up in the air. I think that's where like French theory and postmodernism went too far, where they abandoned the material basis of economic categories. But anyways, that's my reading on Derrida. Did you have any questions about that? Was that?
Yes, I mean, I had one question on a point you made. This is my lack of theoretical knowledge. What do you mean by this was Derrida trying to kind of explore a Levinasian? You incorporated Levinas there. Why was that?
I think that what he's trying to do is put forward this paradigm of the finitude of the citizen, of the modern subject, whereby we are sort of subordinated to a horizon of submission to an alterity of the other, which is fundamentally unknowable. So
in the Levinasian sense, I see.
In the Levinasian sense, he's trying to think the absolute other, and that democracy can be thought as a system that gives us the sort of trappings for the creation, like this notion of radical democracy. Derrida is very influential here. And the Levinasian idea is how one can forge a relationality in the face of the absolute other. In other words, how can I maintain the freedom of my autonomy with full recognition that there is a kind of impenetrable excess that the other elicits in me? It's not fully knowable. It's a kind of beautiful Jewish Christian meditation on the other that Levinas gives. And ultimately, it's kind of like this claim that there's a kind of a residue of the other which cannot be fully integrated in a certain way. And he has this idea of the face of the other, and it's a kind of very interesting humanism that Levinas gives. I think in general, in his reflections on Levinas and violence, Derrida is very interesting here, where he does talk about friendship quite a lot. Ultimately, I think this notion of friendship, though, for Derrida, is one in which he misses the Marxist and Hegelian tradition, because he subordinates it to this very idiosyncratic Heidegger-Schmidt thing.
Schmittian, yeah.
Yeah, that's my one challenge with him. I find his reading of Nietzsche fascinating. I find the Nietzschean provocation to this kind of fictional idea of the friend as like almost this idea that Nietzsche is trying to do the same thing to the enemy that Aristotle and Montaigne are doing to the friend, is very, very interesting in a certain way, because Nietzsche is sort of, as I read it, he's showing us that we need an enemy, even if that enemy is artificial. So that allows Derrida to read Nietzsche's category, say, of the herd, as almost a metaphor. And in my book, you may know that I tend to demetaphorize Nietzsche. I ask, what does it mean to read Nietzsche's categories, even of, like, say, slavery or his anti-socialism, not as, like, metaphors, but actually as, like, actual political positions that he's taking? The conclusion from that is a very different... he becomes a lot more of a directly political thinker. But for Derrida, he's much more of a marginal. He's almost an anti-political thinker.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear what kind of response you've gotten from left Nietzscheans on you, because you do try to, like, in a way, challenge this notion that Nietzsche is a decentered anarchist philosopher who hasn't really got a view. And I think a part of that is what you just described. Excellent. So, I mean, you made some really... There was a lot there which I think I need to reflect on and write on just for it to, like, really settle. But, so, let me just say, Daniel, like, for me, in some broad sense, I am a class reductionist. And what I mean by that is, you made an important point. You said class is not an identity. It's a relation. And in fact, as Jodie Dean points out in her essay, Comrade, it's a relation between comrades mediated by a fidelity to a truth. And that's really important for me. So this is where I'd say I remain a Marxist. So along those lines, I just want to ask this really naive, elementary question. For you, as a Marxist philosopher, as a Marxist yourself, who is a comrade? And also, who is not a comrade?
I would say a comrade would be someone for whom solidarity is forged through a love of and through a sharing in a commitment to struggle on the one hand. Now, that can take many different forms, and that the immediacy of struggle is something which is not immediately evident. It's not something that the surface produces. You know this once you become a reader of socialist thought and theory. Once you get involved with the struggle, something very interesting happens to you, which is you go back and you speak to your family members and you see, oh, wait a second, they experience the same struggle, but they don't internalize it the way that I now do, right? So I think that comrades are, in a way, something close to a potentially universal category. In other words, a comrade is extraordinarily open category, meaning that a comrade can become a comrade because they already suffer and experience the degradations and the limitations on their full expression and their dignity and the consistent exploitation that is shared by virtue of existing in capitalist society. The question, I think, of a comrade is one who has been capable of locating these realities and made some type of tacit commitment, acknowledgement to them. And so immediately, I don't want to say that the comrade is a comrade of some abstract idea. Nor do I want to say that the comrade is a class comrade in some way whereby I assign a vulgar idea of their origins or their occupation, or if you make this much money, you cannot be a comrade. I want to avoid that. I want to avoid that. But I think at the same time, there has to be some acknowledgement that one does not need a theoretical training in order to understand that there is a realist basis to the degradations that capitalism brings about in everyday life. And I think that a comrade is someone who has been capable, and often this is very difficult because the system of what we might call bourgeois ideology, and by that I just mean the mechanisms by which our conception of social struggle, social strife, social conflict gets kind of rerouted in artificial or superficial ways, it's sometimes very hard to break from those sort of mechanisms of propaganda. I think a comrade is a figure who has had some elementary break from this. This is why Gramsci and Lenin in the history of Marxism are very big on the category of common sense. Lenin affirmed that the common sense of the everyday worker will tend to have, in its just general directionality, something leaning towards a socialistic worldview. That is not to say that it won't get perverted and rerouted and misdirected. Of course, it very well could. So even in that common sense, there is a becoming comrade, right? I think a comrade is from there, from that point, that we can elaborate and subtract. I think a comrade also is a figure of subtraction. We have to subtract from the regime of common ideology to affirm something like the affirmation that another way of life is possible, and that we actually have a role in the construction of that other life. That would be a comrade for me. A comrade would be somebody who is capable of acknowledging and prepared to act upon the basis of social exploitation and oppression that envelops this world. And the other thing I'll say as a final point, a comrade also has to develop the mechanisms, the skills, let's call them skills, to be able to concoct something like a total account of the system. Now, since the 1960s, you have a lot of system theory that has many different forms, and there's world systems theory, there's different forms of social justice theory. I think the superiority of Marxism, right, is very unique, because what Marxism is capable of doing is showing that racialization, imperialism, colonialism, the exploitation of wage labor, the oppression of women, all have and can be filtered through a common point of analysis, right? A common point of analysis that can comprehensively address these points in a rigorous way, in a true way, in a way that's tied back into material reality and processes. Not every common sense proletarian worker will know that, but they will have a premonition of it. They will have a premonition of it. It's tapping into that premonition that is necessary. And there's a learning. It's not as if everyone is equal. There's a learning. And the learning is of the capacity to link these struggles in their multiplicity, right? That is and more advanced. There can be comrades who are more advanced than others, right? And we should honor them. We should honor them. I think one of the problems with a lot of left-wing social justice activism is that it has, in many cases, fetishized youth as somehow in touch with a type of wisdom that adults lack.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I'm not a fan of that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the vision of comradeship that I would want to put forward would be one that would not necessarily reject youth as not offering anything qualitatively compelling or interesting. No, there's all kinds of positive merits that youth bring. But the problem that I have is this fake generational division whereby elders are deprived of the continuity of their own wisdom as having nothing to say to the struggle. This to me is ludicrous. This is absolutely insane. It's almost schizophrenic. It's too schizophrenic for me, right? I'm much more in line with the idea that theory and practice, that's the other thing with class consciousness. Class consciousness is a moment which is a unity of theory and practice. It's a kind of possible. It's possible for class consciousness to achieve something like this. Class consciousness is not this spontaneous affirmation that we are oppressed, right? Class consciousness also has to have an extra element of the practical, of a directional, of an intentional directional element. You could even say of a teleological element, right? A telos, a purposive consciousness. That's a huge debate. We don't need to get into the specificities of this. But many dissertations could be written about the granularity of this. But you see my point. I think that, to summarize, a comrade is a figure of subtraction, capable of identifying shared struggle, and committed to an egalitarian future. Egalitarian is a key word, because egalitarian is not the same as equality. This is a very important point. When I say a comrade is a figure of subtraction, I get this from Alain Badiou. He has this beautiful idea of the politics of subtraction. Insofar as if we are subtracting from the dominant ideology, right, we are affirming egalitarianism, which would be of a different quality, of a different measure than the versions of equality that are currently operating. What we know about the current versions of equality is that they're not adequate. We know that much. So a comrade is a figure who affirms that the existing institutions are inadequate. I think a comrade must have some affirmation of that, So these are my immediate thoughts, please.
What's interesting is that last point you made, and thank you for clarifying. I had a question on the subtraction, and I think that you kind of did clarify what you meant by that. But what I was about to say was, what's interesting about this notion of acknowledging or sort of coming to this realization that the existing institutions are inadequate is like, it's like everyone, that would probably be considered common sense now. Everyone would agree. Like, I don't think the most apolitical person I've spoken to would agree that, oh yeah, the current institutions don't work, or politicians aren't corrupt, and there's something really interesting. I'm not even sure where I'm going with this, but there's something really interesting there where, with that acknowledgement, in a way, for me, that's like where everyone can be a comrade. Everyone, if you start from that point of like this like negation even, everyone can be a comrade. As you say, there's something universal to it, no matter our background. I want to say something else. So I think I kind of want to really hone in on this notion of class not being an identity, and more importantly, perhaps the fact that comrades, it's a It's a way you relate. It's a political relation. And I'll ask this question this way. So when I read the essay by György Dean, one part that really spoke to me, and this probably is partially a bit because of my background, but is this notion that of viewing comradeship or being a comrade against what she calls survivors and systems. So for me, I'd be like more against identity politics and against this kind of administrative neoliberal management, almost Kafka's systems. And I'm wondering, could you probably speak a bit more into that? Like, how can the idea of comradeship really be taken up to, in my view, sort of, I don't know if the term is suppressed, but let's say counter these like dominant ideologies of like, identity politics, or even this like almost like neoliberal management you see in like corporations and all of that, which as Alain Badiou says, does create a sense of like despondency or cynicism in subjects and people.
Well, I think first off, there has to be a materialist analysis of social reality. And this is where I think, Lukács's reading of Hegel becomes very interesting to me, because he thinks, right, that philosophy is also can be inducted into the service of a very practical project of like the knowability of shared social reality. So I think that oftentimes this idea of liberal identity politics functions on a lot of half-truths, and it functions on a certain dogmatism, which itself is in service of the existing state of things. Now, how do we know that it is in service of the existing state of things? Well, in a way, I think that we can only know that when we have concocted a group or a collective or a party that is affirming an alternative to it, And I think on that basis, we need to create rival institutions, which I would include counter-public podcasts and study collectives in that. They're not fully political. Like what we're doing is not a fully political act. It's political education, but it's about the construction of something, a horizon of a form of political reality making and education that would give people the strength to be able to discern true politics from anti-politics. So like if we go back to the Kirk thing, we know that bourgeois institutions wanted a particular hyperbolic response to be made, and we just have to reject it. But we can't just reject it as individual monads. It's going to have more force if we reject it collectively. So there has to be something. And for György Dean, this is the party. But keep in mind, she's trying to tether with a very interesting dynamic apropos the party, which is the idea that Antonio Negri and Alain Badiou and many contemporary Marxist philosophers have put forward the argument that the party is dead. And Dean wants to empirically resurrect the party. Now, we should take full account of the difficulty of this. It is a very difficult thing. It's a difficult thing on many levels, because on the one hand, you can have a kind of abstract idea of the party, where you have a kind of assortment of a kind of general fraternitas, a general fraternity amongst Marxists. Something like the invention of a new international would, I think, be the order of the day, in which many parties can coexist under it, right? Which is something that we lack, and that historically the Marxist tradition always had. This, I think, is essential, the construction of a new international, which would be a receptacle for the multiple expressions of socialist activity. We lack that, so we have further organizational atomization, which is a challenge. I would say that in that atomization at the same time, one can still develop virtuous relations to comrades. Because this kind of goes back, I was thinking a lot about this. I do think that Aristotle's right about the friendship of virtue, And I would qualify comradeship, not always necessitating virtue, but I think it's fair for us to say and to argue that at its highest ideal, it would be a virtuous relation. And we shouldn't, I think, shy away from that or reject that. It is still a virtuous relation. And I think the greater degree of virtuous activity in building the resolve and the strength is for future generations to fortify themselves against the dominance of dominant politics. I think one of the challenges we face in our own time about how to address liberal identity politics is that, in a way, it's so ubiquitous that it has become an ideology that is absorbed by management, by capitalist managers, and used to divide people and to sow discord. And that is self-evident. The reasons for that are self-evident. We don't really need to create fancy theses about that. It's self-evident to every worker, right? And it's usually almost definable vis-a-vis reductio ad absurdum in a certain way. The good news with that, I think, is that the bourgeois institutions no longer really have an exit from it or an alternative from it. In the United States, you could say that it's like Obamaism in crisis. This idea that the ruling class needs an ideology for their legitimacy. I think comrades should be super conscious and careful about the way that the thoughts they develop amongst each other in subtraction from these pressures. Those thoughts can also be the source of something co-opted. Right now, the number one question in the United States is whether the possible mayor of New York, Mamdani, will become Obama Part 2 or not. His base of support are very wealthy people in New York, which is a challenge. It's positive, many of the things he says about socialism. That's a benefit. But there are true challenges here. The main one is this problem of co-optation, you see. This goes back to the subtraction thesis. It's not only because of virtue and the construction of theory from the pressures of bourgeois ideology that we need subtraction. We also need subtraction in a more materialist way so that the direction of our activity is not so easily co-opted, because that's what they want. And in fact, I would say the desperation of the contemporary bourgeoisie is so immense that they are looking for anything, even socialists. So yes, it is possible that Mamdani could be fundamentally taken over, co-opted, and we need to be careful that doesn't happen. He needs to be surrounded by people that will be strong comrades, that would prevent this. What you might call in a colloquial sense, selling out, right? Right? It's true.
Yes.
It very easily could happen, right? And I'm not saying that as some purist. I think that's the other thing, is that because socialism doesn't exist within the parliamentary system, one of the challenges that we have is that we really fail and lack to discern right and left. We don't know right and left. We don't know right and left because socialism is not a part of the system. So much would be clarified. For example, what do we know as progressive is like the Joe Biden, Obama wing. But if socialism were part of the mix, it would be so evident that this form of politics is anything but progressive. In fact, it is highly conservative. Right?
Yes, I mean, I think I've heard Zizek say somewhere that now almost the conservative party in the US are the Democrats. They want to maintain institutions. He said it somewhat provocatively, but you kind of get where I'm getting at with that, right? So,
I think he's right. Yeah.
And I think, because it's a difficult thing to even for me personally at an existential level to like tackle, because it's like I would say I'm also somewhat conservative in this regard. I do believe in institutions. I do believe in our institutions in the sense that I do believe in civic society. And which is why I completely, as you rightly point out, reject like these acts of gratuitous violence, political violence, whatever they are, and even trying to incorporate that into our politics. They, for me, are palpably a non-political or anti-political. Those are anti-political acts. But then, while at the same time, I also I'm thinking, and here's probably where this notion of discipline, as György Lukács points out in her essay, comes out, where I'm like, yeah, again, bit of a naive question for you, Daniel. What does it mean to be a disciplined comrade?
I think that it, in a way, you need to be careful, because on the one hand, you need to think about discipline. There's discipline to the organization, to the party, which can be a very grueling, all-consuming process for which I have little familiarity. My primary contribution as a socialist is through my writing, through my public education, although I have some history of organizing. It's not my primary avenue. I think one of the things that liberal activism has done that's been very deleterious is that it's said that only activism qualifies as political contribution. I don't think that's true. I think intellectual contribution matters a lot. If not I don't want to say more, but let's just say it matters a lot. So I think that discipline would come through not towing the line of dogma, but towing the line of the careful balance between theory and practice in such a way that one is attuned to social reality and grounded in social reality, which means that a comrade must always have the humbling capacity to be with, or to be of, the common. The common will appear in different places geographically and in one's own immediate social cultural milieu. But you sort of know it when you see it. I think that it's extremely. Now, I'm not saying that we all must rustify ourselves or do what the Western Maoists used to do, where they self-proletarianize, right? Where they are middle class, but they go into the factory by choice, right? For political reasons, to develop class consciousness. I don't think that this practice is necessary, although it could be very strategically useful in some cases. But I do think that there is a sense in which a comrade helps other comrades by defining the basis of commitment, of how, in fact, we are committed, and maintaining that question of fidelity. Especially in a time in which, we are so pre-political. So much of our activity is educative, and has to be, because we are disconnected from the masses. That could change. That could change. The possibility of socialist politics having a more direct political role could easily change in our lifetime, and of course we hope that it does. But at this moment, I would say that we have a virtuous discipline that's necessary around the idea of fidelity. I would say fidelity becomes a high virtue. I would also say, Rahul, that the virtue of modesty would be an important one as well. And here by modesty, what I would want to introduce is something that I talk about in my book on Psychoanalysis, Politics of the Family, which is that the redefinition of what it means to be revolutionary from the standpoint of everyday life. It's a point that I get from certain psychoanalytic Marxists, whereby their argument is that the ludic, the Dionysian, the festival, is not necessarily this kind of cultural form of politics. The fusion of art with politics is necessary, right? But we have to keep open a bigger tent of defining what qualifies as politics away from aesthetics. Because what I worry about is that a lot of the 68 generation became too Nietzschean in a general sense, because they ended up defining politics vis-a-vis aesthetics. And the danger with that is that the common people, it becomes kind of superficial. They don't appear political. They don't.
Yeah, this is the term champagne socialist comes in, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
as like
part
a
of it. Yeah,
derogative term.
or
Yeah.
even like a hipster type of subculture, the subculture
Yeah.
phenomenon.
Yeah.
That's also something that must be reformulated. Now, what that will entail will also and could also involve the politicization of class as a social phenomenon, which I'm all for. Because I don't agree with many liberals who claim that if you politicize class, you turn class into an identity. I actually don't agree with that. I actually think that if you politicize class, you very well could, if you do it well, if it's organized well, you could very, very well, I think, have the trappings of a political project, of something that would be able to contest. You're not duplicating identity politics by politicizing class. Why? Because the experience of class cuts all of those identities to begin with. It already shapes them and colors them. So what you've done is you've created a more intentional receptacle for the common expression of them, which is itself, because capitalism uniquely oppresses the working class, which is something we haven't mentioned, because of that fact, it's not as if the affirmation of class oppression will result in the working class desiring for its own servitude. You know, that kind of negative Deleuze and Guattari Spinoza point, right?
Spinozian right? sense, yeah.
I don't think this is the maxim of class politics. Class politics is abolitionist, even when it is affirmative, precisely because it's affirmative over the desire to transcend that shared condition, not to preserve it. That would be ludicrous. That would be a logical fallacy to think that it's about preserving that condition. You see my point?
I certainly do. I certainly do. Yeah, there was a lot there. I actually was going to make a point or something you said, but I think it just missed me. But I think... Oh, first of all, Daniel, can we go for about 5? Because we're way over time. Can we go for about 5 to 10 minutes more? Is that okay? Sure. I hope you're not too tired. I'm making you...
No, I'm actually just... Sorry. I feel like I'm just warming up, actually.
Oh my god, fantastic! I mean, I forgot that you're used to this. So, because normally most guests I have on after an hour 15, they start to get tired. So this is very good. This is very good. Let me see this. Oh yes, it came back to me. And there's a reason I asked you this question earlier on about this notion of discipline, right? Like this is really important for me. And what I mean is, so first of all, I couldn't agree more, this notion of decoupling aesthetics with politics. I mean, one thing, again, to go back to sort of like my master signifier, Zizek here, he says that what he hates is these art biennales where, you know, people, they talk about the hell, drink champagne and all fancy and talk about, I don't know, how capitalist system, consumerism, materialism, and then, you know, buy really expensive art. Like he hates that kind of performative kind of, this kind of hipster leftism, as you put it. But then the reason I kind of do this notion of discipline speaks to me is because, for instance, if I take Marxist economists like Paul Cockshott, now whatever people think of his ideas of scientific socialism, all of that, I just gotta say, like, I do like that here are Marxists who, while they completely understand the importance of praxis, of activism, of, you know, being out on the street, so to speak, they're also trying to develop alternate systems. So can we have centralized planning? How would a centralized planned economy looks like? What are the viable options? And for me, that's intellectual labor. That's hard work. That's difficult work. He incorporates, obviously, as you know, computer science into his work, and, you know, can we have a system of computing for the economy? And so, and this probably even relates to this notion of like what Zizek talks about, what happens, I'll, I'll sell my mom to slavery to know what happens in V for Vendetta Part 2, all of these things that he says. I'm curious, like, have you had any reflections on that, this notion of, as comrades or as Marxists, where does the building happen? Where does yes, a part of it is, as György points out, the organizing, the kind of the work of kind of the activism, but also if we are to imagine alternate systems, alternate realities, even, how does that look like to you, like a really practical day-to-day basis? Where does the discipline of that work come in for you?
So I would argue that part of the challenge here would be what we have in our advantage is our strength in numbers, and socialists need to remember that fact, which is an intrinsic power that means that we have some touch to the electoral parliamentary system in general. Like it's not like something that we can escape. We're not anarchists in that way, meaning that to organize the working class is about the achievement of power, the taking of power, right? In some sense, through any means necessary. Now, when we talk about post-capitalist planning, we introduce this question of bureaucracy, the historical record, the fact that past socialist revolutions had to incorporate existing bourgeois planners into planning the new society. So class traders, bureaucratic class traders become an important category, in fact, right? The experts are necessary, right? Now, there's a lot of reflections, because what you're really asking about is what is called in Marxism the category of dictatorship of the proletariat, which, of course, does not have a wonderful name because of the word dictatorship. But all that it refers to is the idea that the condition of the worker in capitalism is to not provide the means of the social reproduction is not guaranteed for the worker. As such, the dictatorship of the proletariat names the necessity for emergency rule to put a stop to this situation. In that process, there is therefore a second negation that takes place, in which a new society and the thought of a new society will germinate, will develop, and where a new laboratory will emerge, in which the questions of social planning will be managed in common amongst the exploited. This is a very important point. In that period of time, a new relationship to leisure will be developed, and class consciousness will enter into a new altered state. It will not be the same. It will not be the same. So you could say almost that there's pre-political, political, and then there is this intervallic period of dictatorship of proletariat, in which I think the question of planning of post-capitalism emerges. But think about it this way. If I said, here is my blueprint for post-capitalist society, from the standpoint of it would be quite undemocratic and anti-egalitarian, because our conceptions of what post-capitalist society could be is still a limited reflection of the hierarchy and domination of thought under our current system. So there has to be a period of time in which there's a gradual transfer of power, a reorganization of power, a reorganization of the class problem, in which the working class is introduced to regimes of labor that are no longer so onerous on their free time. In this period of time, I think we have something like the question emerge of cultural revolution as well, right? And out of that comes the birth of a new social arrangement. So that allows me to not answer the question directly, because Zizek in Occupy Wall Street criticized the protesters precisely for not having a plan for quote unquote what comes next. But I think that's what he missed. He missed Marx's notion of dictatorship of proletariat, which is a period of time after you take power in which you still develop this because you have broke from the old order of things. And that, theoretically, will be a cultural as well as a knowledge and imaginary break. And in that break, something new can be thought. Something truly new can be thought. The other interesting point I'll say about this is that historically we have many examples of this. You could call it the commune period. There's other states that went through this transition, right? This is why I think that existing socialism, like even in China, should not be fully rejected as just totally complicit with capitalism. Because if we did that, it would be the same rejection of the continuity of history of their tradition, which is I think, an abuse to that continuity. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned China there, because I was thinking of China. I'm just reading this book, Breakneck, and this idea that, like, Dan Wang, he makes this point that in China, they're a nation that builds. They're all engineers, or at least let's just call it the state, the government, the CCP, and this idea that they're constantly in this notion of engineering, building, and they try to even, as a result of that, even social engineer, e.g. the one-child policy and all of that. But, like, of course, so the way I relate this to this conversation about being a comrade and all of that is, like, I'm perhaps it's just my nature, my penchant. I'm interested in that question of, if there is the dictatorship of proletariat, where does the building take place? Where does the, so to speak, engineering take place?
What I would say, Rahul, is this is a question which requires a rupture. I really don't.
Interesting.
I really don't think that this kind of goes to the humility of comrades, of current socialists. I mean, I think on the one hand, yes, Cockshott and other thinkers that have theoretical formulas for social management, for the questions of new modes of exchange, for how do we abolish the capitalist form of value, those are very important questions. It's not as if the rigorous study of those will necessarily alter dramatically in the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But in subtle ways they could. Because also we have to introduce a new model of consensus in leadership that's no longer tied to the same mechanisms that the bourgeoisie as a class uses to develop its own power base. So that question of political power also needs to change, which we don't need, per se, blueprints for that, per se, right? To some extent we do. To some extent, I think there's many texts and there's many interventions of Marxist thought. I'm thinking here of the wonderful text on the question of political leadership and the rethinking of the entire category of dictatorship of the proletariat from the Marxist sociologist Goran Terborn, Therborn, Goran Terborn. He's retired, but fabulous thinker. He really gives us, I think, the way to restructure government according to class imperatives of a Marxist vision. And even there, he's less concerned about solving post-capitalist society from the standpoint of a technocratic solution. Because if you think about a technocratic solution itself, is it not succumb to a type of rule by experts or a type of elitism? A little bit it is. I'm not necessarily opposed to it in total, but I think it would have to be funneled back through a new radical democracy of the working class. That's my view.
Wonderful. Daniel, this has been very enlightening. I mean, this is probably my last question. In many ways, you probably have answered this in parts of our discussion. Given that most likely communism won't be realized in our lifetime, so you never know, the future is radically open, but most likely, how would you say, should comrades be optimistic, or should comrades find courage and hopelessness, to use the Duquesne little aphorism there?
I think that there needs to be some affirmation of the hopelessness of our present, because without it, a wayward shift, far away, at worst, a fundamental depoliticization, or really at worst, would be a move to some type of anti-Marxist position or far-right position, which of course we've seen these examples. So a kind of naive optimism is not what I'm necessarily offering, although I would affirm that a level of egalitarian optimism must be at the elementary ground floor of all of our activity. Otherwise, we lose the energy and the resolve to keep going, not in some Pavlovian sense, not in some fake it. No, that's not what I'm arguing, but more along the lines that if one is a historical materialist, if one is a student of revolution, you cannot walk away from that without a fundamental optimism regarding the profound effect that the revolutionary tradition has had on egalitarian possibilities of social life. Meaning that revolutions fundamentally alter, in an asynchronous way often, not in some direct chronological way, the very possibility of shared social life. I'm of that mind. That revolutions actually are something which introduces a very Blockian, Ernst Bloch, a very Blockian idea, that they introduce an element of an optimism of what he calls the not yet conscious. They open up a new temporality, and that temporality is fundamentally forward-facing and fundamentally optimistic. So that element is possible. We know. I mean, if you are subordinated to conditions of social life in which your social reproductive possibilities are not guaranteed, which many of us are, right? You'll know. You'll know that you don't really have time for despair, pessimism. That in some sense it's narcissistic. The crises are too immense to just sort of capitulate to that. It's uninteresting. It's uninteresting to wallow in hopelessness. It also, and the other reason I'd say, and I'll close here, is that it also could result in an aestheticization of despair, which of course
in the
we see.
Guardian sense, melancholy, yeah.
I got in trouble once by advocating that the left not be celebrating melancholy. Everyone was very mad at me for saying that. I was a little confused. That's a whole other thing, but I'm of the mind that a kind of principled optimism is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, you're probably gonna hate me for saying this. From all people, Dennis Prager said that happiness is an ethical obligation. I think leftists, we should take that on. Like, I think that the optimism, forget happiness, but optimism, we sort of have an ethical imperative to be optimistic towards, and put that optimism into work, of course. Daniel, my God, this has been so beautiful. Thank you so much. As I told you before, I've been a student of yours from afar, and finally it's just fantastic to just have a conversation and just, kind of riff off some of the ideas I had. And it's just one thing I always do with these discussions is, which I will be doing for this too, where I'll be doing a kind of a follow-up write-up, kind of reflecting on what you said. And I think that's where, for me, in fact, sometimes a lot of the learning does happen, and even some of the, to use a cliche term, inner transformation, as you mentioned about writing. But again, Daniel, thank you very much.
I'd love to come back, Comrade. I really enjoyed it. I very much enjoyed it, and I feel like you open a space where my thought and energy feels very much at home. So thank you for that. And like I said, I feel like I'm just warming up. So that's a sign that it must happen again.